Every kid who ever dreamed of being famous had a father who told them to get a real job. Michael Jackson had the opposite. He had a father who had already failed at 2 dreams of his own and who was not going to let his children fail at his 3rd. To understand the king of pop, you have to understand the man who built him. And the strange thing about Joe Jackson is that almost none of it happened the way the story usually gets told. He didn't plan it. He didn't see it coming. It started by accident with a guitar nobody was allowed to touch. Today, we're counting down how a man who never won anything built the most successful family in the history of popular music, and what it cost the son who made it happen. Let's get into it. Chapter 1: The 2 Dreams That Died. Joe Jackson was born in Arkansas in 1928, the eldest of 5. His parents separated when he was 12. He bounced between his father in Oakland and his mother in East Chicago, and at 18 he settled with his mother and went to work at a steel company without finishing high school. He had 2 ways out, and he tried both. The first was boxing, and he was not bad at it. He came up through the Golden Gloves program and had real hopes of turning professional. The second was music. In the early 50s, he played guitar in a blues band called the Falcons, alongside his younger brother Luther. Boxing ended first. He met a 17-year-old named Catherine Screws. They married in November 1949, and he put the gloves down to support a family. The band lasted a few more years and never got a record deal. By the time both dreams were dead, he was a full-time crane operator, and the family was growing fast. Chapter 2: The 2-bedroom house on Jackson Street. In January 1950, Joe and Catherine bought a small 2-bedroom house in Gary, Indiana. The street it stood on was called Jackson Street, which is the kind of detail you'd cut from a screenplay for being too much. 10 children were born into that house between 1950 and 1966. 1, Marlon's twin Brandon, died at birth. 9 survived, and every one of them would eventually have a hand in a hit record. 2 bedrooms, Gary, Indiana, a steel mill, 12-hour shifts, and a man who had already been told no twice. That's the situation. Now here's the part that everybody gets wrong. Chapter 3: The guitar nobody was allowed to touch. The usual version of this story says Joe sat down one day, looked at his children, and decided to turn them into a business. That is not what happened. Joe owned a guitar, and his children were forbidden from touching it. Around 1963, his son Tito touched it anyway, and Joe caught him. What Joe heard when he caught him changed everything. The boys could actually play. Not adequately, genuinely. Think about the shape of that. The most disciplined musical operation of the 20th century began with a kid breaking a rule and getting caught doing it. Joe didn't have a vision, he had a discovery, and it arrived roughly a decade after both his own dreams had died. Long enough that he'd stopped expecting anything. He started with the 3 eldest, Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine. Marlon and Michael came in later. The youngest, Randy, was still too small. Chapter 4: Perfection or Pain. What Joe did next is the part nobody defends. He ran the living room like a gym. Rehearsals were long, they were constant, and they were supervised by a man sitting in a chair holding a strap. Michael described it plainly in his own 1988 autobiography. They'd perform, their father would critique them, and if you messed up, you got hit. Sometimes with a belt, sometimes with a switch. It worked, in the narrow sense that it produced results. The brothers stopped missing notes. They stopped missing steps. They became precise in a way that adult professionals were not, because the cost of imprecision at home was physical, and they were children. Michael was 5 when he joined. The Polish everybody would later admire was, at the beginning, fear with choreography on top of it. Chapter 5: Big Boy. They won talent shows. They won at the Regal Theater in Chicago and at Amateur Night at the Apollo in Harlem. The hardest room in America for an unknown act, and a room that does not applaud out of politeness. Then, before Motown, before any of it, they signed with a small local label called Steeltown Records and released a single called Big Boy. Michael sang lead on it. He was 9 years old and it was a local hit. Everybody skips this chapter, and it's the most important one for understanding Joe. He didn't wait to be discovered. He got his children into a recording studio himself, on a label nobody has heard of, in a city nobody was scouting. By the time the big label came, there was already a record. Chapter 6: The Man Who Actually Found Them. Here's the myth, and it's a good one. The story most people know is that Diana Ross discovered the Jackson 5. Motown's own debut album for the group was called Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5, released in December 1969, with liner notes on the back signed by Ross herself. None of it was true, and Motown knew it wasn't. Gladys Knight had flagged the group to Motown early and was ignored. What actually moved the needle was Bobby Taylor of Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, who shared a bill with them at the Regal Theater in Chicago, became convinced and personally brought them to Motown. He produced the bulk of their first sessions. Berry Gordy simply decided the public should be told it was Diana Ross, because Ross was the biggest name he had and she was about to launch a solo career of her own. One story sold 2 acts. Joe Jackson spent a decade turning his sons into the tightest act in America, and the moment they arrived, the origin story was taken off him and given to someone who wasn't in the room. Chapter 7, Gordy's house, not Joe's. The rise was immediate and it was enormous. I Want You Back, then ABC, then The Love You Save, then I'll Be There. The first act in history to open with 4 consecutive #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. But notice who was giving orders. In August 1969, it was Gordy who told the Jackson 5 and Joe to move from Detroit to Los Angeles. It was Gordy who assigned the producers, picked the singles, and wrote the mythology. The man who ran his living room like a boxing gym had walked his family into a house with a bigger fighter in it. Chapter 8, Fired at 21. Now the part that almost every version of this story gets backwards. People assume Michael broke free because Thriller made him untouchable. The sequence runs the other way. Michael turned 21 in 1979, gained legal control of his own career, and fired his father as his manager that year. Around Off the Wall, 3 years before Thriller came out. He didn't wait until he was the biggest star on earth to get out. He got out first and then became the biggest star on earth. His brothers followed in 1983. Joe, who had built all of it from a 2-bedroom house, was out of the business he had invented. Chapter 9, The Sickness. In February 1993, Michael sat down with Oprah Winfrey and described what his father still did to him as a grown man in his 30s. He said a look from him was enough to frighten you. He said there had been times when his father came to see him and he would get sick, that he would physically start to bring it up. He was one of the most famous men alive. He had the catalog, the records, the stadiums, and the sight of the man who made it possible made his body react before his mind could. Michael also said in the same breath that he loved his father and didn't know him. Both of those were true at once, and he never really stopped saying so. Chapter 10, What Joe Said. Joe never accepted the accusation the way his children made it. He denied it for years, then acknowledged he had hit them with a strap. Asked by Oprah in 2010 whether he regretted it, he said no, it kept them out of jail. In a 2013 interview, he explained that Gary was full of gangs, that he had to be that way, and that he was glad he was tough because his children came out professional, off drugs, out of prison, and loved everywhere in the world. That is his case, and it deserves to be heard alongside the rest. It is also precisely the argument of every parent who has ever confused a good outcome with a good method. Joe Jackson died in June 2018, aged 89, 9 years after Michael. Michael had cut him out of his will, from 2 dead dreams to 4 straight #1s. From a guitar a boy wasn't allowed to touch to the Apollo Theater. From a strap in a Gary living room to a 21-year-old firing his own father. Joe Jackson built something nobody has ever built before or since. 9 children out of a 2-bedroom house and into the record books, from a man who had personally failed at everything he tried. And he did it with methods that left the one who mattered most unable to be in a room with him. Both of those are the same story. That's the uncomfortable part, and there's no version of this where you get to keep one and throw away the other. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe for more of the stories behind the people who made the icons. And drop a comment. Do you think the Jackson 5 could have happened without Joe? Or was the cost the price of the music? See you in the next one.